So, my name is Jackson Foster. Dr. Harry Edwards is a respected and famous trailblazer in the intersection of sports, sociology, and racial equality, and was a major influencer in advancing blacks in the management of sports America. He is most famous for founding the Olympic Project for Human Rights, where he started a bigger conversation about the role of black athletes, pushing against Myers' conceptual incarceration and the idea that simply playing on American sports teams equates to racial equality. Because of this, Dr. Edwards is a key figure in the advancement of optimal conceptual theory. Dr. Edwards has personally experienced the challenges of growing up in an American black ghetto, where the soul of the black individual was not acknowledged. Dr. Edwards then broke out and went to college as a disc thrower for the San Jose State University track team. As a side note, I am from the Bay Area in California, so I am interested in his work. Dr. Edwards was a black athlete, but he obviously understood that true impact comes not just participating in the system, but changing it from the inside out. Or in other words, by not bowing down to the white historical colonized culture, but to proudly highlight the African worldview values of endurance, interdependence, and dignity in spirit. This is why Dr. Edwards decided not to play professional sports, but to become a scholar in sociology, one who incites activism in others. Dr. Edwards received his doctorate degree in sociology at Cornell University and later taught at UC Berkeley, which is close to where I grew up. More recently, he was a staff consultant for my favorite teams, the San Francisco 49ers and the Golden State Warriors and the San Francisco Giants. One of Dr. Edwards' most famous lines in the following: "We must teach our children to dream with their eyes open." The chances of you becoming a Jerry Rice or Magic Johnson or Kobe Bryant or Tom Brady or Slim, the black kids must learn to distribute their energies in a way that is going to make them productive, contributing citizens. As an activist scholar, Edwards calls himself a reformer. For example, in the 1960s, when Dr. Edwards was growing up, the media reported that he was no institutional racism because you could point out to black athletes having access to sports, recreationally and professionally. But Dr. Edwards knew there was a lot of work to be done, because Linda James Myers says black people experience conceptual incarceration when they live in a European American oriented culture and are forced to accept their place. So, and unfortunately, even today, black athletes feel the result of this imbalance. For example, response from the NFL and most white owners and head coaches to Colin Kaepernick's taking a knee during the national anthem and his protest to police brutality and system racism is an example of conceptual incarceration and the reality of white culture that black people have been forced to adapt to. If they don't adapt, they get locked out. The way Kaepernick did, this was an infringement in his right to work simply because he challenged structural racism and white supremacy. And the dominant group, in this case, is the NFL, is not more important than the individual soul or the collective good of humankind. So, Dr. Edwards highlighted these ideas in his book, which was written in 1979, The Revolt of the Black Athlete, which really should be required reading for every MLB team owner or managers, because an excellent, or NFL or NBA or even NHL, an excellent guide in terms of sports management and social justice. As Edwards says in his foreword, hopefully this book will be read and understood by many people, but particularly by those who control athletics and exert political and economic power in America. For is the latter to have power to correct the injustices that besets the American sports scene. The New York Times Magazine wrote that no other single figure in sports has done as much to make the country aware that the problems of the larger culture are recapitulated in sports, that the arena is no sanctuary from drugs, racism, and corruption. However, there was a lot of backlash after Dr. Edwards' book was published, because to express feelings of black exploitation in any ways, to react being used and not being compensated properly as an athletic, has been reframed since Myers' Act. As Myers explained in her book, the cultural worldview decided that the behavior of non-immigrant Africans in the Americas, in other words, people who were forced to come here from Africa, to be insane and therefore justified by abuse by the white people who imprisoned them. Myers' Act is supported by the African cultural worldview, which prioritizes the soul of the black individual, not the psychology of the dominant group. In Kaepernick's case, the NFL And in Edwards' case, look at the Global Olympic Committee. The most famous example of Dr. Edwards inciting on behalf of black athletes was the Olympic Power. This Olympic project from the Human Rights, which encouraged black athletes to boycott the 1968 Summer Olympics in Mexico City. His movement resulted in the iconic Black Power salute, which revealed the powerful role athletes can play in socio-political movements. The Black Power salute was when Tom McSmith and John Carlos, who were athletes at San Jose State with Dr. Edwards, raised their fists on the 1968 Olympic podium in Mexico City, which symbolized and later launched the Black Power movement. In his book, The Black Scholar, Dr. Edwards says of the Olympic Project for Human Rights, "We are siding with the Black African countries. The U.S. and most of Europe had defended South Africa's apartheid. Why are we indulging these racists in sports when the Olympic Charter itself says that discrimination in terms of who can or cannot participate in banned?" Why is that? So Dr. Edwards and his Olympic Project for Human Rights demanded the removal of South Africa from the games and the reinstatement of Muhammad Ali's world heavyweight boxing title. Look at the generational consideration of more black coaches and the removal of the International Olympic Committee president because of his racist actions. This Olympic Project for Human Rights directly acknowledges African ancestry and encourages us all in the United States as well as globally to consider these conceptual constraints. As Dr. Edwards said recently in the video on his slide, it is still all about a transaction. Blacks are a commodity to be purchased back way before, like several years ago. But according to the Myers and Nelson and their scholarship, we must use the discipline of Africology as a lens to interpret the world. Objectively, from African teaching and cultural worldviews, humans and cultural dynamics are inseparable. So they must be reconciled. Otherwise, we will just have more madness and insanity. Look at this, defined by the Western American psychologists, and more justice and cultural incarceration is defined by those of African ancestry. But just like Kaepernick, Dr. Edwards was almost locked out of receiving tenure at UC Berkeley, despite being published more than anyone else in the sociology department, having the largest classes, creating new discipline in the field, and being the expert of the sociology of the sport. He was also followed by the FBI 3 years of speaking at. In fact, he was on the FBI list that Hoover personally handled because he was viewed dangerous by the state and being anti-American, simply because he was against the conceptual incarceration of blacks. But Dr. Edwards persisted in contributing to advancing OCT by publicly recognizing the oppression which prevents true sustainable well-being among blacks. So Edwards told Time magazine that he wants to serve as a role model, the promising athlete who gave up the possibility of a career in professional sports to become a scholar instead. Whereas Muhammad Ali, who drew Dr. Harry Edwards from San Jose State, once said, "The service you do for others is the rent you pay for your room here on earth." Dr. Edwards has paid his rent.